I met Brian last year. He was my instructor during a couple of my ITIL classes, and he is a wealth of knowledge. And not only does he know how to teach it, but he has the practical knowledge to really help explain that. So we're excited to have him. He's with Knowledge Toolworks, and so I'll let him talk a little bit about that and give you some more details about his long list of certifications and experience. So please welcome Brian Shue.
Okay, great. Glad to be here. Jay said I've been teaching ITIL for a long time. I also do consulting on ITIL and other service management frameworks. One of the things I tell people is that I don't have a life, okay, because this is what I do for fun. Okay. To prove it, my license plate is ISO 20K. And that's true. So, so what I want to talk about today, really frameworks, because we just had a conference in Dallas last week. Anybody go there? So, a bunch of things going on at the Gaylord, and primarily focusing on ITIL. Okay, and so one of the things that I do when I talk to organizations about ITIL and service management, we also want to include other frameworks, because ITIL is not the only framework out there. Okay, if you talk to some of the ITIL people, they will tell you that is the only thing out there. But there's a lot of other things, and we want to talk about why it's important to at least know what they are. Okay, so what I want to do is just kind of go through some of these other frameworks in international standards and give you guys a chance actually to ask questions about them. Okay, and the reason I was very interested in this was my background was in consulting. So I worked with Deloitte Consulting, and we had done a lot of proposals on implementing products. And when we started working on service management, we would have we'd always have someone in the group say, "Stop. Let's stop the project. And did you look at this other framework that I heard about?" And then we'd have to stop and go look at that and say, well, yeah, we looked at that and now we like this one. Then someone else would say, well, stop, I heard about this other framework. And so one of the things that I actually do now when I go in and when I'm doing consulting is we actually get this out of the way up front. Okay? We lay it out and say, here's all the options we have and here's why we chose this combination of frameworks. Because there's probably not one that just works for you. There's going to be aspects in all of these frameworks that actually can help you work together. So, just quickly, see if the remote's working. Okay. Basically, I said I don't have a life, so I like taking exams for fun. How many of you like taking exams? Are they fun? Fantastic. They're a lot of fun. Jay will tell you that, in class we just have, that's the fun part, right? Taking all these ITIL exams. So I've been ITIL expert and in version 2 service manager, 20,000 consulted, certified information system auditor, COVID certified, PMP, MBA. I did get my MBA just like 2 buildings down over there. So SMU 2001 here. So. Let's see. I guess it might just be better to. Okay, so what I do right now is we actually develop training materials and offer training. Okay, I'll keep that as a simple message. I do have something that we will give out at the end of the presentation. We have a poster showing the ITIL processes, and I think that'll be very interesting. So let's start talking about why these frameworks are important, or important to know about. Like I said, this is the learning part. They said networking, Terry said networking, fun, and learning, right? So this is the learning part. We'll try to have fun with it too. And again, I want you guys to ask questions. So this isn't going to be just me lecturing to you. We want to actually understand why they're important. So talking about best practices. And we're going to talk about best practice and process, and what does best practice mean to you guys?
something you want to do. You do it so well, you want to keep doing it.
It's what people do well, right? So it's what we do well in the industry, and ITIL is a documented source of best practices, so that's a good place to start. So best practice, having a standard way to do things that organizations can use, and consistently shown results. So we go out there and we try to find things that work. How many of you like to create, reinventing the wheel every week? Is that what you guys want to do at work? So we really don't have to. And that's why we want to use these frameworks, is actually to guide us and understand why we're doing things. So there are lots of sources of best practice. So we have public domain frameworks, and we also have international standards. So public domain frameworks, we have things like ITIL and COBIT. CMMI, MOF is Microsoft Operations Framework. And then also Six Sigma is a bunch of tools we can use for helping us in our process analysis. And also international standards like 9000, 20000, ISO 27000 series, and 15504. Those are all fun standards. Some of you guys like all these standards and numbers and things. Are they fun? No? Okay.
So Brian, will you explain the difference between a framework and a standard?
Absolutely. And that's good. That's actually a good thing to know about. When you talk about a framework is a set of guidelines. In ITIL, they say that we should be adopting a framework of best practices and then adapt it to your organization. An international standard is actually something that an organization can get certified against, which means it has a checklist. So you will do this or you will not do this. So ISO 20000 is actually a combination of ISO 9000 and ITIL. So it brings the quality management approach of ISO 9000 with the best practice of ITIL. And it actually has statements like, thou shalt record all incidents. Okay, it doesn't quite say it that way, but that's what it means. It's close. It says all incidents shall be recorded, is the actual statement. So, international standard is actually a checklist of here's what needs to be done, and a framework is going to be more of guidance of best practices. And a framework's not a methodology. So a methodology would be what? How to do it, or a set of steps. So prescribed steps. So here's some of the frameworks we're going to talk about today. Just give you kind of an introduction to these and compare and contrast a little bit. But first, let's look at a process. Because these frameworks are focusing around process. Why are processes fun? Fun's the right word, isn't it?
Get things done.
Well, everything's a process, isn't it? Right? Do you put your socks on before your shoes or after your shoes? Is there a specific order in which you do things? We do things without even thinking about it. We do things consistently because we found out that's the best way to do things. I usually put my socks on first before I put my shoes on. Okay? That's a process. Set of steps. Repeatable. And that's the main thing that we see in a process, is that we want repeatability. We want to figure out what works well and do it again. We want to figure out what doesn't work well and skip that. Okay? So that's what we're trying to do here. It's measurable. One thing about a process is I can go out and measure, and by measuring that means I can also improve. Okay, I can be repeatable, and now I can improve it. It creates a specific output, and that specific output benefits a customer, and the customer, we can say that is probably another process. So we have a lot of interrelationships between processes. So basic process theory, SIPOC, basically the supplier provides the input, the process acts upon it to create the desired output, and that output goes to a customer, or in many cases, just another process. So the key here is process is good because it's repeatable. We want that repeatability. Another key concept is the Deming cycle. You guys heard of the Deming cycle? You've heard of react, do, react again. Is that correct? That's not part of the Deming cycle. That's IT.
The IT cycle.
The IT cycle is react, do something, and react again. Now this actually makes sense if we think about this. It's plan what you want to do, then do is implement and operate. Check that you're actually doing what you had planned, and then act is to continually improve. So the Deming cycle is actually the core of ISO 9000, which is also going to be part of ISO 20000 and 27000. So this is the concept that we like planning and then doing. How many of you in IT like jumping to conclusions? Is that the way we want to manage IT?
It's fun. That's the fun.
It does happen though, right? So what level of maturity are your organizations in IT? You guys had a maturity assessment done? Does it matter? And it may not even matter. But these are some of the things, like I said, I just want to bring out and talk about. Most maturity models are just groupings of activities. And they'll say, if you do this group of activities and do them okay, you're at this level of maturity. So we'll talk about CMMI as being one of these. And many of the frameworks have maturity models built in there. But usually we have these group of activities that show us that we can improve in maturity. Now, one of the things that the maturity will actually show us is that generally as you increase in your maturity level, you're probably becoming more repeatable. So CMMI for services talks about having repeatable processes. Level 2 has 10 generic steps that have to be done for every process. They're called generic practices for institutionalization of a managed process. Little things like having management commitment, funding, resources, training, little things like that. And the key there is, as we go up in maturity, we're becoming more process focused. And because we're more process focused, we're going to be more repeatable. And being repeatable means that we're then going to be able to improve, and we're also going to be focusing on the repeatable good steps that we have, right? And hopefully avoid some of the bad things that we do. So repeatability is good. And so I mentioned CMMI. You guys heard of CMMI? CMM, Capability Maturity Model, and I as integration. Created by Carnegie Mellon and part of the Department of Defense. So DoD needed to understand how to judge software organizations. So when they go out to request a bid from a vendor, they want to know how well the vendors are capable of performing against that project. And so that's where CMM came around, so measuring the maturity of an organization. And there again, it gets back into capability. One of the international standards that we're going to focus on is security. You guys have IT security groups? It's over. We really don't need those. We don't need passwords, right? Is that correct? These are the guys that slow us down from doing everything. Actually, that's not the case, but actually we realize that security has become more important. It's hard to find a week that can go by where there isn't some security event, IT security event in the news. By the way, you don't want your company in the news talking about IT security, is that right? Unless you're selling software about security to cover some event that somebody had. So this is important to us. This is actually going to now be part of everything we do in IT. So there's a standard, and like I said, with an international standard, we're going to have a checklist of things that we are going to have to do to say that we're compliant or certified against the standard itself. So 27,000 series, there's actually a whole section of parts to the standard. But 27,001 talks about just setting up some terms, the information security management system itself, management responsibility, and that's a big one, okay? So management responsibility, management commitment, what does that mean in IT? I saw a good explanation in a Dilbert cartoon. Had the pointy-haired manager, and he was telling Dilbert, you have my full support. Just don't bother me with details or ask for money. And why I thought that was great, because that is that 100% opposite of management commitment. Okay? Management wants to be involved, or should be involved, and should also make sure that funding is there to actually do the job well. The resources are available. With security, we're going to do internal audits, and we also have a list of control objectives. So ISO 27000 is really about information security. The Deming cycle is actually integrated into many international standards. Like I said, ISO 9000, 20,000, 27,000, actually part of the standard saying here's how we should actually make sure that we implement. That we, first off, I don't know, it starts off with something silly and says plan. Actually, in this case, it starts off with the requirements coming in, right? Understanding the requirements, then plan. So plan your information security management system. Establish that, do, implement and operate, check, maintain, and then the output of this should be at least an attempt at secure information, right? And obviously you have to do this quite frequently from a security perspective, because security threats change, daily, hourly. So we have to keep up on this. I actually recommend most organizations just, go to external consultants where this is what they do, because it does change so much. Setting up the framework is very important. Having the audits actually done really needs to be done by specialists. Now here's one you may not have heard of. You guys familiar with Microsoft? They make something called Windows. So, Microsoft Operations Framework. Have you guys heard of that? Solutions Discipline. This is actually really neat stuff, because this is some aspects in here that aren't really in some of the other frameworks. A lot of the other frameworks are talking about processes that need to be performed, and what you have here in these diamonds are actually called readiness reviews or management reviews. And these are really great because it kind of puts it into a life cycle and says, you know what, these are the types of reviews at the different stages that we should have. And I've looked at lots of different frameworks, and this is actually unique to the Microsoft Operation Framework and actually provides some really good and decent information. So I've heard a lot of people say, well, it's Microsoft, they kind of discount it. I actually like it. Good information there. So it talks about, having a portfolio, a review, a project plan approved, readiness review, then we have policy, then we have operational health, service alignment. So all of these kind of go in that life cycle, and they actually, and those are not in other frameworks. So when I said earlier that one of the things you have to do is actually pick the frameworks that you're going to be working with, what you're really doing is you're picking the processes and the activities that actually will provide value to you.
What aspect of IT would you say this focuses primarily on? Is it the operations development, software development, or is it service? Governance,
really. Governance. At this level, this is governance of IT. Now, if you get in, here's problem management. This is in the operational stage. So when we talk about delivery, we're talking about ITIL service transition. Planning, we're talking about certain ITIL service strategy, service design. So there's a lot of overlaps there. But like I said, what I really like is setting up these management reviews and defining those at certain stages. And that's a really good differentiator from this framework. Now, ITIL is probably going to go into more detail in problem management than Microsoft will. And another part that I actually like about the Microsoft framework is the risk model that we have here. You guys familiar with risk? What is risk?
Probability of success or not success.
Success or not success? Absolutely correct. So risk is just something that might occur. There's a risk that I can win the lottery to this week. Risk isn't good or bad, but you know what? From an IT perspective, we can't ignore risk. We can't ignore bad things that could happen, but we shouldn't also ignore good things that could happen. And if something good happens, shouldn't we be prepared to take advantage of that? And if something bad happens, shouldn't we be prepared to respond to that and minimize the impact? Absolutely. The key is we have to manage it. We have to identify risk. We have to manage risk. We have to develop a plan at certain levels of probability. So this actually is a diagram for the Microsoft Operations Framework, and I'll show you the next slide talks about an international standard for risk management. Now we can buy very expensive books on risk management, or we can go to Microsoft's website and get it for free. Okay, so guess what I do? I've looked at the expensive books in ISO 31000, and guess what? This actually complies or is suitable for ISO 31000, the international standard for risk management. And it's laid out very well online. So a lot of good information out there if you know where to look. So risk is important to us, so we should have a risk framework. And ISO 31000 is an international standard based on for risk management. So establish the context, identify risks, analyze, evaluate, treat the risks, monitoring, and communication. So that's the basics of ISO 31000, which will also be part of the Microsoft risk discipline. So have we gone all over the place on these frameworks so far? Absolutely. Have we seen anything that conflicts with each other in any of these frameworks? The answer is no.
Not unless you got the detail, you would.
And you're really not going to find conflicts in the detail, because, I mean, change management. How different is change management going to be in the different frameworks? Not different. Could they have more emphasis on one area than another? Absolutely. But we're not going to find a huge difference. What we see to find the difference in the frameworks is actually the scope that they're focusing on. But when you get into the detail, they're complementary. So COBIT and ITIL work very well together. COBIT's a little broader, focusing on governance and security. ITIL is a little narrower, focusing on service management, but giving you more detail. So I see a lot of organizations adopting COBIT and ITIL. So that's another thing about frameworks is, they're again, risk management. I can use, ITIL, COBIT, and then use the Microsoft risk discipline without really anything conflicting at all. COBIT, this diagram actually comes from COBIT 4. They haven't released COBIT 5. But the concept here deals with COBIT has 4 domains. Plan and organize, acquire and implement, deliver and support, manage and evaluate. Monitor and evaluate. And so those 4 domains, there's 34 processes, and each process has multiple activities. Now, COBIT's also a publicly available framework. You can get it from ISACA, the Information System Audit and Control Association. So we like acronyms, right? Is that correct? So COBIT's great because it actually started off as being one of the frameworks that auditors use for auditing IT organizations. Have you guys been audited? Has your IT organization been audited? Okay, what are the requirements for an IT auditor?
Me.
So, well actually, they have to have a pulse. They have to be out of college for 6 months, and they have to know how to spell IT. And it's really funny to see someone that's 24 coming out of school telling a CIO how to run IT. It's hilarious. Well, what they do is they actually go back to COBIT, and there's an audit guideline called Assurance Guidance in COBIT that actually has questions. You should ask this question, and here's what the answer should be. And this is what IT auditors generally use. This is actually why we see COBIT a lot in organizations, because this is what the auditors are looking at. And I would want to be a little proactive and make sure that I cover the bases of COBIT and ITIL to make sure I also cover what the auditors are looking for. You guys ever got a bad audit report? What happens when there's I think the phrase is non-conformity. What do they normally say? What do they normally want you to do? Fix it now. Is that how they phrase that? And so a lot of times if we can get ahead of that by at least knowing the framework that the auditors are using, we actually can be well prepared for that. So I like COBIT. COBIT's actually broader than ITIL and very complementary to ITIL also. Now I mentioned ITIL because this is probably one of the frameworks that most of us have heard about. You guys familiar with ITIL? Everyone heard of it? Okay. So it's about the life cycle of service. So we have service strategy, service design, transition, operations, and continual service improvement. So ITIL is probably going to be the most well-known of the service management frameworks. But as I'm talking about this, there's a lot of other frameworks that have nice little tools and components that can work in any framework that we have. So how many of you have ITIL or are using ITIL in your organization? So is ITIL good? Do you want ITIL? Or do you want the results of good service management practices? We really want the results more than the framework. That's why ITIL says adopt and adapt. And ITIL is non-prescriptive. It doesn't tell you how to do anything. It just says what should be done. And then you adopt and adapt it for your organization. And so nobody can be audited against ITIL because there's no checklist of things that have to be done because it says do what you want. Just make sure you kind of do some of this, right? So we actually can use, like I said, tools from other frameworks when we're working with ITIL. And ITIL will be, like I said, will be the most common framework. Have you guys heard of Six Sigma? Okay. So Six Sigma is a set of tools. So Sigma means standard deviation. How many of you like calculating standard deviations? No. Yeah, I actually downloaded Solver for Excel. Okay, come on. Did I say I don't have a life? Okay. So those of you that know what Solver is, yeah, you agree with me now, right? So standard deviations are really, we go one standard deviation away from the mean. We're basically covering one standard deviation either side is about 66%. Is that about right? 69%? 68 something? Then we get further out, and we get out to 3 standard deviations either side. We're at 99.73%, which that's a lot, right? So 3 standard deviations or 2,700 errors per million opportunities. So out of 1 million transactions at 3 sigma, we're going to have 2,700 defects or errors in the process. So 6 sigma goes out twice as far, which means that we're going to have 3.4 defects per million opportunities. Is that a big difference? So Six Sigma is really a group of tools that, and a way to use statistical analysis for actually driving down to minimizing defects. So some of the tools they have here, I did say we like acronyms, right? DMAIC, define, measure, analyze, improve, control. Failure mode effect analysis, voice of the customer, SIPOC, supplier input, output, supplier input, process output, customer. So those are things that you may hear about from Six Sigma. So Six Sigma is really part of my toolkit. It's not really a framework. It's a toolkit that I use for identifying opportunities for improvement, for measuring, for looking at, can I improve? Should I improve? I'd also want to know, is there value in improving? So I can do a lot of things better, but is there really any point to it? So is it good enough, or do we have to improve more? And there again, we can actually set some goals within Six Sigma here. I'm going pretty fast, I think. Do you guys have any questions?
You will.
You will? Good, good. ISO 9000 is really our a quality management system approach. It's an international standard. With ISO 9000, you can have the process to create a concrete life jacket, certified. Okay, you really can't, but it's almost more about just having a repeatable process than really the output. And actually, it does talk about the output and reviewing with your customers. But it's about maintaining quality in your process. And what's one of the first things you have to do to maintain quality in your process?
Build it in to begin with.
Pardon?
Build it in to begin with.
You have to have a process. That's one of the first things. And then I say that you're actually going to do, there's only two things that we do with the process. We follow it or we fix it. Because if I am not following a process, if I'm skipping steps, how many of you skip steps? Come on, you're in IT. If we skip steps, then what happens to our measurements? Because I said earlier, a process was measurable, it was repeatable, it was measurable. What happens to our measurements when we skip steps in a process? Our measurements don't mean what we think they mean, which means that when I go make a judgment on trying to improve, I will make the wrong decision. And I'll try to fix something that's not broken. Or I'll try to fix something and get no impact because you're not even doing that step. And then that'll confuse me and I'll try to fix something else and probably break it. Is that correct? So it's really important that we actually follow a process. But we can't have a process there that's so rigid that it can't change. So the Deming cycle talks about continual improvement. So plan, do, check, act. Guess what? The next step is plan, do, check, act. We're going to be continually improving. So when we have a process, we have to put the process out there and think, you know what? It's not going to be perfect. So don't let perfect be the enemy of good. Is that correct? So we want to make sure that we are actually have the attitude that, okay, we can put a process out there, follow it, and then fix it. Because then we'll be repeatable and we'll be getting the result. If we're not getting the results we want, we at least can start focusing on fixing it. So 9000 provides us with, again, it's it does define certain processes that have to be in place. It talks about keeping records. So it talks about internal audit and how we actually check ourselves to make sure we're actually following our process. Do you guys do internal audits in IT for your process to see that your processes are working well? They may not be necessary because, I think I'm doing a good job, so we don't have to worry about that. Is that correct? Well, we also don't want to audit our own work. So, how many of you have ugly kids? Anyone here?
All of our kids are above average.
They're above. So no one's going to go out there and say their kid's ugly. Is that correct? But guess what? Are we able to be critical about work that we've created internally? Sometimes it's hard to be critical, or we don't want to be proven wrong, or a lot of things. So there's motivation behind, I don't want to admit I did a bad job. So guess what? We don't want to audit our own work. We want other teams that are, so internal audit, we actually set it up, we have other teams actually do that audit. So if I'm the incident manager, I shouldn't be auditing, assessing myself. Might have the change manager come in and look at my processes.
Well, I would think you could audit yourself on an informal basis, as you said before, to get ready.
If you can actually accept some of that,
Well, that's,
yeah, a lot of times what we'll do is we'll set up different process areas. Change will assess incident, availability to problem, etc. So that way the groups aren't biased in the actual results. And it's still internal, so we're not telling the world about how great the processes are, right? So, and this is where this concept comes from. It actually starts in ISO 9000 in monitoring our processes to make sure that they are effective. So here it talks about, we saw these same terms almost from 27,000 slide, and this actually comes from the ISO 9000 document, the definitions, talking about management responsibility, making sure we have resources available, we're able to measure the output, we're actually producing the output. Customer, provides the input, create the product that goes to output. So basic process there. And then of course, like I said, measurement goes to management. Management's looking at our requirements for our customers, and then adjusting and improving over time.
Brian?
Yes?
I thought ISO 20,000 replaced 9001. Is that not correct?
That is not correct.
Okay.
9000 is generic process. 20,000 is service management.
Okay.
So 20,000 is this with ITIL. Now they tell me that's not the right way to say that. But it's okay to say it that way, because that's really what it is. And we'll see in 20,000, I'll point out some of the areas there. But 9,000 is where the quality management system approach really comes from a formalized standard perspective. And 20,000. So 20,000, if we look in the middle here, if you're familiar with ITIL, we see a lot of the ITIL processes. But above that, we see the quality management system, or the service management system, as it's called in 20,000, which deals with management responsibility, governance, documentation, resource, and an improvement process. One of the things I like about 20,000 is it actually mandates improvement. ITIL says, yeah, you should probably improve. But 20,000 says you actually need to create a process for improvement. And so that's one of the things that I like about 20,000. So this is, like I said, it takes and that's what this outer band really means is the quality management system actually encompasses everything we do within the processes themselves. So we talk about the Deming cycle of Plan, Do, Check, Act. That's actually part of establish and improve the SMS. There's actually a section called Plan, one called Do. And what that means is that if we're going to implement business relationship management, guess what? We need to plan that. We need to implement. We need to check. We need to act and improve. So our whole quality management system covers the scope as everything. Then we have design and transition of new services, which also has some overarching aspects of basically the ITIL processes that are in the center here.
So that should say design and transition of new or changed services. Is that what you mean?
Yeah,
Okay.
there's a.
All right.
I never did learn how to spell it. New or changed services is the correct term. Spend all the time lining everything up and not. See, if it doesn't have a red squiggly line, it's not wrong. Is that correct?
Changes and stuff.
Yay for spell check.
Okay, so really we're coming up to the last thing I have here and basically focusing on really an assessment. All of these frameworks.
I'm sorry, can I ask a question? Okay,
Absolutely.
so are you familiar with the HDI Support Center standards?
I am not.
The international standards they've developed?
I am not.
Okay, 'cause that is another, either a framework or a standards, which is,
Do you want to talk about those?
yeah, so.
Because that would be a good context, looking at, then that would be part of the public domain frameworks.
Well, I mean, the HDI has a support center certification program, and they developed them 10 years ago using international practitioners to develop a set of standards. There's like 34 different areas and standards, and it's kind of like a combination of, it's a checklist and it's a maturity model all in one. And it talks about processes and talks about outputs. And there's a lot, and I'm a certification auditor for HDI.
Okay.
A lot of times we get into this question about, well, should I look at COBIT, should I look at HDI, should I look at ISO 20000? And that's why I'm kind of interested in what a framework is versus a standard. I think it's more of a standard, but last year we redid it to include, 2 years ago we redid the standards to include ITIL terminology and ITIL processes. Maybe we can talk later on, because I think you ought to be aware of that
Oh, absolutely.
as another potential framework to compare and contrast.
Yeah, and where this comes into play here, like I said, is when we do assessments that we're talking about here, and we talk to customers about, well, what are your plans? What do you want to? I mean, like I said, I've been on projects where they just get stopped because someone says, well, we want to go implement ITIL. Okay, let's start developing processes. Oh wait, have you looked at COBIT? And I'm telling you, this actually happened. Somebody comes up and says, wait, you need to look at COBIT, and somebody says, oh wait, we want to look at CMMI, and so you kind of stop and say, well, here's why we choose this. So, like I said, now it's actually something I do at the beginning of the project, and to get those conversations out of the way, and also so everyone knows that, hey, these are great resources out there, because I don't care where my change management process actually comes from. I just want a good change management process. Now, I want to have it follow international conventions and be based on best practice. But if in my organization I see an aspect from COBIT I like in change, or the MOF management reviews, there's no reason I can't put those in my process. And that's where knowing all the different frameworks really comes in handy. And I'd like to take a look at some of the HDI stuff too, because that's going to fit in here also. So I think one of the last things we have is really talking about all of these frameworks. You're going to have people that are assessors come out and look at. The frameworks with maturity models, CMMI, COBIT. Obviously, you're going to be looking at capability when you're talking about your international standards instead of maturity. But COBIT has a maturity model. ITIL claims to have one. And I was at the conference last week, and I tried to find anyone that had ever used the ITIL maturity model, and I couldn't get an answer. I actually had someone been working with ITSMF for years, and she said, there's a maturity model? It's like one of the appendices in ITIL. But anyway. So when we do an assessment, what we really look at, and like I said, if you guys have been audited, this is what your auditors are really going to do. They're going to look at your processes. And the first thing we do, obviously set scope, do a review your documents, because again, if your processes, documentation is off, your activities are going to be off too, right? You're not even going to be close. So you can have good documentation, just not follow it, right? Which is kind of what we see a lot too. So we do a document review. We go out to people and ask people, show me what you do. Let's validate some of these findings. We analyze it and develop a recommendation. And this is going to be a consistent cycle of, and you can do this for internal audit also. So this cycle works for internal or external. And the last thing I have is actually just questions. And we were handing these out at the conference last week, and we have these are posters. They're 12 by 36. So they're really long, but we have these back here for everyone. So you'll get a poster, ITIL poster.
Are you mentioned the combination. What is your most common framework that you see or use in your...
The most common I see is ITIL and COVID.
COVID together or separate?
Together.
Together.
And like I said, I actually had done the mapping. I didn't bring it here, but you can actually look at your COVID to view the breadth of governance, and then you go in depth with ITIL, because ITIL is going to give you more detail in the processes than COVID will. But COVID gives you some really good audit capabilities, and again, COVID is control objectives for IT and information-related technologies. So COVID gives you some really good control objectives and actually assessment capability and a maturity model. And it's actually a really good framework. So I see ITIL and COVID together, but then we see a lot of times that we're using tools like Lean, Six Sigma, or CMMI. I'm a big fan of at least level 2 for CMMI, talking about institutionalization of a managed process, and the generic practices there, because that really shows process-focused approach.
And if you're doing ITIL and COVID and Lean and Six Sigma, aren't you going to get so complicated that you'll never get anything done? I mean, I keep hearing about people doing ITIL, and now we have ITIL Lite because ITIL is too much for people.
So this is what we don't want to do. We don't want to do all of them. We want to create change management. We want to create incident management. But we want to know what's out there and know the best of all the frameworks and apply it in our organization. So when you're actually creating your process, this is where you need to know the difference is creating the process and knowing these terms is when you actually need that. When you're actually working in the environment, you're following incident management. You're following problem management. You're following change management. You try not to confuse everyone in IT with all the stuff that I just talked about. It's great to know what's out there and know why it's out there and why it's important. But when I create processes, I go in to create a change process, not to try to do too much or use too many frameworks. Okay? So what I can do is, when I create a change process, I look at the requirements in ITIL, and I look at the requirements in COVID, and I just make sure I've covered all the steps. And then I have my change process in place. And guess what? It then satisfies ITIL and the auditors.
I think that's the important part of what you said was the sitting down to define the requirements early. One of the things I see, again, we deal with a lot of relationships being on the Dell side, and especially for me dealing with services. I need to understand what industry you're in, one, that's a requirement, because you may hit different things.
Absolutely.
And that starts to drive, and a good partner, an entity like you said that's external is also helpful, because just letting me talk, I've got to hit this, I'm in the healthcare industry, I've got to hit that. Then you start to shape options that I have to then narrow.
So, are you in Plano Parkway?
Yes.
Okay. So, if you're dealing with healthcare, guess what? You have another set of rules that you have to comply with. Okay.
Or government. HIPAA and FSMA, the crossing.
PCI. I mean, there's a lot of things that are gonna impact how you manage IT, and all of those need to be considered when we create our service management processes. And the key is we have to know that these frameworks are out there so we can actually look and pick the best practices that are suitable for our organizations. And ITIL, like I said, ITIL actually says adopt and adapt. It's actually a pretty neat little, that's actually good. It doesn't say, oh, you have to do it my way. Now, the international standards are different. They actually say, if you want certification, here's how but it says you have to do something, not how to do it. And so a lot of times with ISO 20000, you'll actually see people use ISO 20000 as a checklist and then use ITIL to actually fill in the details in the process. Any questions? Comments? Ask your remarks?
Do you encourage certifications for your clients?
Like what certifications?
Yeah.
Like for people or organizations?
I guess both.
For people, it's important because job markets can change very quickly. I don't know an unemployed ITIL expert. Okay? Don't know one. That's a good thing. Certifications for organizations. Actually, most of my work on 20,000, I tell people don't do it. Don't get the piece of paper, just follow the practices. Unless you need to prove outside of someone that knows you, you need to prove to your competitors or to prove that you're better than your competitors, then certification is fantastic. But if you just want to have good processes in place, 20,000 is great. You can follow it, but you don't have to get the certification.
Is that because of the cost associated with it?
Yeah, it's about $15,000 just to get the initial. Then that's just the auditing firm. That's not you getting ready to be audited. So, and it's also the maintenance and that. And I have one customer, they wanted 20,000, but they didn't want to do a budget, and they didn't want to have security, and they didn't want to do this. And I'm kind of like, well, then guess what? You've kind of limited the scope of the conversation now. So, yes, so it just depends. For people, I think the certification is important within IT. I know ITIL Foundation certification is important. If people are looking for jobs, it's actually a filter. So you're a recruiter, and who else? Do you guys use ITIL as a filter for some of your positions?
Yeah, search term.
Okay. So, and actually, I think ITIL Foundation really is almost going to be a standard in the industry, for looking for jobs. And I know organizations that say it's mandatory for people to keep their jobs. So, and it also gives you a common terminology. Briefly, I'll just tell you, how much time do I have?
10 minutes.
Okay. Briefly, I'll tell you, I did an assessment on a large organization, and we gave them the preliminary report, said, hey, your incident management process is fantastic. Your problem management process is about mediocre. We use different words, by the way. So we then had a conversation with the sponsor. And the call started off by the sponsor saying, what the crud are you doing? And crud wasn't the word that he had used. Okay, what happened was he just spent $2 million implementing problem management. And we said his problem management was mediocre at best. But they did incident management really well. So we got to further conversations and said, okay, well, what do you do at your service desk? Well, we take problems from users and we fix them. So what they did was they used the terminology of problem. They take problem calls from users and they fix them. So they spent $2 million to do that better. And they did a great job. But when I came in using industry standard terminology, I called that an incident. And their problem management process, problem management according to ITIL, they actually call root cause analysis, which, like most organizations at very low maturity levels or just starting, you're probably going to do root cause only for major incidents and occasionally when someone really screams. And that's what they did. So they were normal at their level of maturity for problem management. They did really good at incident management, but when we had those terms changed around, we had 3 phone calls. And like any good consultant, we changed the numbers. We had changed the numbers and added 3 pages to explain, okay, what the terminology actually should be. So, and that's where ITIL comes into play. That's probably where you're going to find most of your common terminology throughout the industry, because you're going to find more ITIL training than a lot of other framework training just out there and available.
So Brian, take that further. Did they take your recommendation and change their terminology eventually?
Yes, they did. They absolutely did. They were like a $20 billion company,
Yeah.
and then using and so it was one of the things they said, okay, well, and they did eventually do that. Didn't happen overnight, but they did.
Yeah.
Yeah, most of us actually, come into IT understanding a technology or supporting a technology, and that's great. But have you ever seen technology people work together?
Of course.
Okay, work together well. And so ITIL actually sets expectations on how people should work together, what the process inputs, outputs are, responsibilities, terminology. So that's why a framework's really important. Also, that's why ITIL said, I'm not doing it I'm not talking about it because it's something we sell, but it's actually something that's actually important. And so I believe in that. Any questions?
I'm just gonna make a statement. No, that's a good point. I've been on a few calls with one of our customers. And this is a client of mine, and they're in Singapore. And the fact that the folks on the other end of the line were very deep ITIL folks really helped, because we were using, even though it was broken English on their side, we were using common terms, and it made the conversation, multiple conversations, go a lot better because we were understanding each other.
Absolutely.
We were using the same glossary.
Absolutely. And ITIL is worldwide. Absolutely.